In this video, I will walk through the steps to create an epidemic curve, which is a graph used to visualize the onset dates of illness during an outbreak. This tutorial was made using Microsoft Excel version 16 on a MacBook computer. There might be some small differences in keystrokes or steps if you're using other programs or computer types. As you can see, I start with a line list of information about cases during an outbreak setting. The first step to creating an epicurve is to sort this line list by the onset date column. This step is optional, but it makes it easier to see when the earliest case became sick and the latest case became sick, and makes it easier to count the cases. So I'm highlighting the whole line list of information, selecting the Data tab, and I'm sorting by illness onset from oldest to newest. The last thing that I do here is I check to be sure that the checkbox in the top right-hand corner that says My List Has Headers is selected, and I press OK. So now that my data is sorted by the onset date, I can organize the data into two columns. These columns will be titled Illness Onset and Number of Cases. For the illness onset column, we're going to organize our onset dates by a time unit that we select. And this time unit should be about 1/4 of the average incubation period of the illness pathogen. For this example, we're using E. coli as the pathogen, which has an average incubation of 4 days. 1/4 of 4 days is 1 day, so for the illness onset column, I will have the x-axis equal 1 day for each unit. So to start, the first onset date listed should leave a few days before the first case became ill to establish a baseline of case onsets and so the graph can show when the outbreak began. You can either enter the dates manually or use the formula function of Excel to quickly fill in the dates as I have here. You'll list the onset dates using this interval until a few days after the last case became ill to show when the outbreak has ended. Next, we'll move to the number of cases column. If you have a small outbreak with a short line list, you can count the cases manually and fill in this column of the table. If you have a longer line list, or if you want Excel to do this automatically, you can use the equal COUNTIF function. For this function, we'll select the cell, we'll type equal COUNTIF, and then for the first range, we need to select the illness onsets from the line list. In order to do this, you'll just drag down on the illness onsets in that column, and in order for Excel to keep this reference stable even as we pull this formula down throughout the cells in the whole column, we need to add in dollar signs before the column letter and the row number of each of those cells. So once we do that, we can put a comma, and then the next part is to select the illness onset in the first column of your table and do the close parenthesis. Now this formula is ready to pull down to the rest of the cells in the column. And you can see that Excel fills this in with the number of cases that became ill on each of the illness onset dates we listed. The next step is to create the actual graph. So we'll select our two columns of data, we'll go to the Insert tab, we'll select the column chart icon and the cluster column option. You can see that we have this graph here, and now we need to work a few steps in order to format the epicurve. You'll double-click on the chart, and the first thing you can do is change the title. An epicurve should always have a detailed title that includes a description of the outbreak, the type of illness, the location where the outbreak occurred, and the time period of interest. Next, we'll add axis titles to both the Y and the X axis of our chart You can label the x-axis illness onset dates, and the y-axis can be number of cases. We should double check here to make sure that our x and y axes have the scales that we're looking for. Along the x-axis, we talked about the units of interest before being 1/4 of the incubation period of the pathogen, and for this case, it's 1 day. So when we're looking at the major units of our x-axis, we should see 1 day, and similarly for our y-axis, our major unit is 1 case. You can adjust these as needed for the size of your outbreak, and the next thing we need to do is make this look like a histogram. So each epi curve should have no gaps between the columns, so we're changing the gap width to 0%. And it's helpful to separate the columns with a border. So we'll select a solid line black border, and this is also where you can change the color. And so now you can see that we have a representative epi curve that shows the distribution of illness onsets during our outbreak.